Jake Mercer loved his bridge. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple wooden walkway stretching 60 feet across the glassy surface of Lake Serene, connecting his weathered cedar cabin to the little island he considered his second home. But to him it was everything. He'd built it himself 10 years ago, plank by plank, after buying the property with the last of his savings. The island was his escape, a quiet patch of earth with a single oak tree, a fire pit, and the best fishing spot on the whole lake. That's why the letter in his mailbox felt like a punch to the gut. Notice of violation. It read in crisp, bureaucratic font. Unauthorized structure, see attached photo wooden footbridge. Violates Lakeside Estates HOA Article 12, Section 3. All modifications to waterfront properties must maintain community aesthetic standards. You are hereby ordered to remove said structure within 30 days, or face daily fines of $100 until compliance is met. Jake stared at the paper, then at the lake, then back at the paper. His cabin had been here long before the Lakeside Estates even existed, back when this was just a quiet stretch of shoreline with a handful of fishing cottages. But then the developers came, the mansions went up, and suddenly, people who paid millions for their waterfront views decided they got to make the rules. He stormed into the next HOA meeting, still smelling of sawdust from a morning spent reinforcing the bridge's supports. The room was all marble floors and leather chairs, filled with people in pastel polo shirts who glanced at his work boots like he'd tracked in mud. At the front stood Richard Caldwell, the HOA president, a silver-haired shark in a blazer who'd made a fortune in commercial real estate before retiring to oversee community standards. Jake held up the letter. "This is a mistake. My bridge isn't hurting anyone." Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mercer, we've had multiple complaints. The bridge is—" He paused, as if searching for the most damning word. "Unapproved." "By who?" Jake demanded. "By the board," Caldwell said smoothly. "We can't have random structures cluttering the shoreline. It sets a precedent." Jake's grip tightened on the letter. "I've had that bridge for 10 years. Nobody cared until your buddies built their McMansions." A titter ran through the room. A woman in pearls whispered something to her husband. Caldwell's smile hardened. "The bylaws are clear. If you refuse to comply, we'll have it removed and bill you for the cost." Jake left before he said something he'd regret. But as he stood on his dock that night, watching the lights of the big houses glitter across the water, an ugly truth settled in his chest. They weren't going to back down. 2 weeks later, he woke to the sound of diesel engines. He burst outside, just in time to see the bulldozer, a hulking yellow beast, roll onto his property, flanked by 2 men in hard hats. One of them held a clipboard. "Mr. Mercer, we're here on behalf of the HOA to—" Jake didn't let him finish. "Get off my land." The man sighed, like this was just another Tuesday. "We have a court order." There was nothing Jake could do. He stood there, arms crossed, jaw clenched as the machine tore into the bridge. Wood splintered, nails screeched. By noon, all that remained were jagged stumps sticking out of the water like broken teeth. The foreman handed him an invoice. "Demolition. Fee $2,400. You've got 30 days to pay." Jake didn't take the paper. He just stared at the wreckage, then at the lake, then at the mansions on the far shore. That's when the idea started to form. If they wanted to play dirty, fine. But Jake Mercer knew something they didn't, and he was going to make them regret it. Jake sat in his dimly lit cabin, staring at the wreckage of his bridge through the window. The lake's surface was still, mocking him with its calm indifference. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the table, in front of him, but he hadn't touched it. Not yet. Anger burned too hot for numbness. He grabbed his phone and dialed the only lawyer in town who didn't golf with the Lakeside Estates crowd, Marta Vasquez, a no-nonsense property attorney with a reputation for chewing up bureaucrats. "They can't do this," Jake growled as soon as she picked up. "That bridge was on my property. It didn't touch their precious community land." Marta sighed. "Let me guess. Article 12, Section 3? "How'd you know?" "Because HOAs love that one," she said dryly. They use it to ban anything from satellite dishes to pink porch lights. But let me pull the bylaws and see what we're dealing with. 2 days later, Jake sat in her cramped office, flipping through the HOA's governing documents. The more he read, the tighter his chest got. "This is insane," he muttered. "They can fine me for visual pollution? Who decides what that even means?" Marta leaned back in her chair. "The board does, and unless you can prove they're targeting you specifically, which, let's be honest, they are, there's not much we can do. Courts usually side with HOAs on aesthetic violations." Jake clenched his fists. "So that's it? They just get to destroy my property because some rich jerk thinks my bridge is ugly?" Marta hesitated. There might be another angle. She pulled out a county map and tapped a faded line near the lake's edge. "This is the original property survey from 1952, before the HOA existed. See this? The lake isn't natural. It was created when the old timber company dammed up Spring Creek." Jake frowned. "What's that got to do with my bridge?" "Maybe nothing," Marta said. "But if the HOA's control only extends to the current shoreline, and the water itself is technically part of the county's flood control system." She trailed off, a slow grin spreading. "Then their authority might not be as absolute as they think." Jake left her office with a stack of old land deeds and a simmering hope. That night, he spread the documents across his kitchen table, tracing property lines with a flashlight. The more he dug, the clearer it became. The HOA's claim over the lake was flimsy at best. Then he found it. Buried in a 1973 maintenance report was a single sentence. "Primary drainage valve located at Northeast Cove, see map grid B7. Jake's pulse spiked. He grabbed his boots and a flashlight. The Northeast Cove was overgrown now, hidden behind a tangle of blackberry bushes. He hacked through the vines, sweat dripping down his back, until his flashlight beam caught the glint of rusted metal. There, half buried in the dirt, was an iron wheel valve the size of a truck tire. Jake crouched down, brushing off decades of grime. The valve was stiff, but it turned. Just a quarter rotation. Somewhere beneath him, water groaned. He sprinted back to the shore. The lake's edge had already receded, just an inch, but enough to leave a damp ring on the rocks. Jake's breath came fast. He knew exactly how to make the HOA pay, and it started with turning that valve all the way. The valve was the key. Jake sat on the floor of his cabin, surrounded by crumpled maps and scribbled notes, his mind racing. If he drained the lake, even partially, those pristine waterfront properties would be nothing but mud and exposed dock pilings. The thought of Richard Caldwell's face turning purple with rage was almost enough to make him laugh out loud. But he couldn't just yank the valve open and walk away. This had to be calculated. Surgical first, he needed to know exactly how the lake's drainage system worked. The faded maintenance reports mentioned a network of underground pipes leading to Spring Creek, but the schematics were incomplete. He spent the next 2 nights sneaking along the shoreline with a flashlight, prying open rusted access panels and tracing the path of the pipes. On the 3rd night, he found the master control box, a locked metal cabinet near the old dam, hidden behind a thicket of poison oak. Jake didn't hesitate. He snapped the padlock with a pair of bolt cutters and swung the door open. Inside was a series of levers and a yellowed instruction manual from 1964. Warning: full drainage may take 12 to 24 hours depending on seasonal water levels. Perfect. He memorized the sequence: main valve first, then the secondary gates, before slipping back into the shadows. Timing was everything. He needed the lake to drain fast enough to cause chaos, but not so fast that someone could stop it before the damage was done. And he needed an alibi. That's when he remembered the annual Lakeside Estates Summer Gala, a pretentious party where the HOA board patted themselves on the back for maintaining community standards. This year, it was scheduled for Saturday, night at Caldwell's mansion. Every important member of the HOA would be there. Jake smiled. He spent the next week preparing. He bought a cheap prepaid phone to avoid any digital trails, scouted the quietest route to the valve, and even practiced the sequence of turns in his head. He'd only get one shot at this. The night of the gala, the lake was eerily still. Music and laughter drifted across the water from Caldwell's sprawling estate, where strings of lights glowed over a crowd of champagne-sipping socialites. Jake waited until the fireworks started, literally. At 9:30 p.m., the first explosion of color lit up the sky, drawing everyone's attention upward. That's when he moved. He kept to the tree line, his boots silent on the damp earth. The valve was exactly where he'd left it, cold and rough under his hands. He took a deep breath, then threw his weight into turning it. The iron groaned in protest, then gave way with a metallic shriek. Somewhere beneath him, water roared to life. Jake didn't wait to watch. He was already sprinting back toward his cabin when he heard the first distant shout. By midnight, the panic would start. By dawn, the lake would be gone. And by the time the HOA realized what had happened, it would be too late. The first sign, something, was wrong came just before midnight. Jake sat on his pour. By 2 a.m., the real chaos began. Docks that had floated effortlessly for years now listed at sickening angles, their supports exposed like broken bones. A $1 million speedboat groaned as it settled into the mud, its hull scraping against rocks no one knew existed. Then the phone started ringing. Jake had his scanner tuned to the local emergency band, and the panicked calls were better than any radio drama. "Dispatch, this is 12 Lakeview Drive. Our pier just collapsed. Oh my God, there's mud everywhere. Caldwell, you better have an explanation for this." By sunrise, the full extent of the damage was clear. Lake Serene was now puddle serene, a sad, shrinking ribbon of water surrounded by acres of stinking, cracked mud. Dead fish glinted in the morning light. A kayak lay stranded 50 feet from where the shoreline used to be. Jake grabbed his camera and strolled down to what was left of the water's edge, snapping pictures like a tourist. A cluster of shell-shocked residents stood nearby, their designer pajamas splattered with sludge. One of them, a silver-haired man Jake recognized as the HOA's vice president, pointed a shaking finger at him. "You! This is your doing, isn't?" Jake widened his eyes in mock surprise. "Me? I just live here." He gestured to the apocalyptic scene. "Though I did warn you guys about messing with the natural order of things." By noon, news vans lined the entrance to Lakeside Estates. Reporters breathlessly described the ecological disaster, while camera crews zoomed in on the pathetic trickle still flowing from the drainage pipes. Richard Caldwell emerged from his mansion, now conspicuously not waterfront property, to give a press conference. His tan looked gray under the TV lights. "This is clearly an act of vandalism," he sputtered. "We've contacted the county to—" "Actually," came a voice from the crowd. Marta Vasquez stepped forward holding a thick folder. "According to 1952 land records, the lake's drainage system is part of a flood control easement, meaning—" She smiled sweetly. "The county has no obligation to refill it unless all affected property owners agree to the costs." The crowd erupted. Jake leaned against a tree, watching as millionaires realized they'd have to pay to restore the very lake they'd used as an excuse to bully him. Somewhere beneath the mud, the valve waited, still turned, and Jake still had the emergency HOA meeting that night was pure pandemonium. Jake arrived early, taking a seat in the back of the community center as furious residents streamed in. The air smelled like expensive perfume and desperation. Richard Caldwell stood at the podium, his crisp blue suit now wrinkled, his perfect hair disheveled. "People, please." He banged his gavel as shouts erupted. "We are working with the county to resolve this." "Resolve it?" A red-faced man in a yay polo shirt stood up. "My property value just dropped $2 million in 12 hours. A woman near the front waved her phone. "Zillow already changed my listing from lakefront to mudflat adjacent." Jake bit the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. Then Caldwell spotted him, his eyes narrowed. "This is your doing, Mercer. I know it." The room fell silent. Every head turned toward Jake. He leaned back in his chair, feigning innocence. "Prove it." Caldwell's face turned an impressive shade of purple. You've been a thorn in this community's side since day one. First that eyesore bridge, now this. Jake stood slowly. Actually, he said, pulling a folded document from his pocket, I think you'll find this interesting. Marta Vasquez stepped forward, taking the paper. This is a 1964 easement agreement, she announced. It states that the drainage system, including the master valve, falls under the jurisdiction of the original landowner's heirs. She paused dramatically, which, as it turns out, is Mr. Mercer's grandfather. The room exploded. You mean he controls the lake? Someone shrieked. Jake let the chaos swirl for a full minute before raising his hand. When the room quieted, he shrugged. I might be persuaded to turn the water back on, if certain conditions are met. Caldwell looked like he might have a stroke. This is blackmail. Call it whatever you want, Jake said. Here's my offer. 1. My bridge gets rebuilt at HOA expense. 2. All fines against me are revoked. And 3. He smiled. You amend the bylaws so no one else has to go through this ever again. A murmur ran through the crowd. The vice president leaned over to whisper frantically in Caldwell's ear. After a long, tense minute, Caldwell gritted his teeth. Fine. Jake tossed a key onto the table. The valve's locked now. It stays that way once the lake's refilled. He turned to leave, then glanced back. Oh, and Richard, next time you want to bully someone, maybe check who actually owns the water first. 2 weeks later, Jake stood on his brand new bridge, wider, sturdier, and officially HOA approved. Below him, Lake Serene sparkled, back at full capacity. On the far shore, a for sale sign stood in front of Caldwell's former mansion. Jake cast his fishing line with a satisfied sigh. Some things, it turned out, were sweeter than revenge, like watching karma do your dirty work for you.